Good morning and welcome back to Planet Althistory. Today we are going to discuss what if ancient Greeks discovered the Americas. The Greeks were known for many things: philosophy, Greek theater, Greco-Persian War, their gods, but also for the colonization of the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. Greek colonization happened for many reasons. One reason was that the city-state, the polis, became too big and that enough people would be able to leave and build a new city from scratch. One other reason was trade opportunities that would arise from such a colonization, and another reason was a strategic one. There were many alliances during that time, and each polis needed to have good allies to compete against other Greek city-states. There were also, of course, other reasons which we can't completely understand or know by now, like for instance maybe a god who dictated something to someone during that time. Anyway, the colonization effort around the Mediterranean is nothing new, because Carthage, and before Carthage the Punics, they did the same, and probably many other people as well. The Greeks, who were disunited for a very long time, they copied in that sense what the Punics or the Carthaginians were doing, and many cities, regions and area, they became populated by a Greek population. Southern Italy, for instance, was even called for a long period of time Magna Graecia. Moreover, until even nowadays, Ukraine, Russia, Georgia, they have a small Greek minority, and a minority that doesn't exist for only like 100 years, but a minority that was there since a couple of hundreds, if not even thousands of years. The Greeks were able to keep their influence for a long time, and even until today, the effects of Greek colonization are visible. Several explorers actually also existed in our timeline, the most famous one being Pytheas. It is even claimed by some people that Pytheas actually discovered Greenland, and some they even stretch it that far, saying that he even went to Newfoundland in today's Canada before the Vikings. But there is no proof at all for it, and it is a very wacky theory for now. The thing is that all the sources that claim this voyages of Pytheas, they don't exist anymore. And those that claim that he did such a voyage are actually people who used these sources apparently. But since those sources don't exist anymore, it's very difficult to say whether he even existed in the first place. So there is a lot of questionable stuff that we have in our timeline. The discovery of the Americas happened, of course, much later, officially, and yes, the Americas, they were already inhabited, but when I'm talking about the discovery, I mean from the European perspective. And yeah, Columbus wasn't, of course, the first guy, but it was officially Leif Erikson. But even with Leif Erikson discovering North America before Columbus officially, the efforts and the effects, they were really negligible if we compare it to Greek colonization, which was way more influential. So, what if all of that changed? What if ancient Greeks discovered the Americas? First of all, let's discuss about a certain point of divergence where the ancient Greeks could discover the Americas. Let's just say that Pytheas actually did discover the Americas, and yes, I know it is ASB, but just bear with me. He would discover the Americas and sail back to Greece, or to Massilia actually, where he was originally from. And the news would then spread also to Greece. He is in OTL credited for the thin trade between the Mediterranean and Britain. So of course, if we want the Greeks to even consider populating the Americas that early on, without taking even logistics, supply, shipbuilding, etc. into account, you would need the Greeks to be interested in some type of resources from there, right? And in that case, since it would be likely that Pytheas could have discovered a place like Newfoundland, he could probably find fur very interesting. Not only would it be necessary for his crew in order to sail back to Europe, and due to the cold, for instance, but it could also look very fashionable, and it would be the only thing that could really catch the eyes of future Greek traders. Maybe they could also find the ivory very interesting that exists in there, but I would consider fur more interesting in that case. They would bring a lot of fur with them, as much as they could, and as a result the fur trade between the natives from Newfoundland and the Greeks from the Mediterranean would then start. It would take a couple of decades until more Greeks would go there, and yes, the accounts of Pytheas would then get more known and Newfoundland could be called Thule or Hyperborea. That could be the new name of the Americas later on. Atlantis or any other name of some places that were used as a metaphor, they would not be taken at all. They would just be plainly rejected. Now, of course, many other things happen for the next couple of centuries, and since Pytheas would be from Massilia originally, the main connection between Thule and Europe would be through Massilia, or between Hyperborea and Europe. And during the Roman Punic Wars as well as Caesar's siege, and after it, many Massilians would probably choose to seek refuge or new life in Hyperborea. Also between Hyperborea and Europe, there would be new colonies set up. Probably Britain and Ireland as well as Iceland, they could have a more Greek influence as well, even perhaps Greenland. From there, the colonies, they would be a mix between natives, Greeks, some Phoenicians, some Celts, and even a few Inuits, and the world would be a little bit more connected than in our time. Technology would spread around and new trade connections would also be made. Perhaps some fruits and vegetables from Mexico or even Peru, they would find a way up to Hyperborea and then to Massilia. All of it would happen gradually and slowly, and we would not get an age of sudden exploration, but rather have a very slow development in this timeline. Why would the development be slower? The colonization efforts in this timeline, they would not be made by a big central state or empire. But the colonization attempts, they would be made by certain traders or by a group of people only. And remember, the Greeks, they were in ancient times very disunited, and it was only Alexander the Great who managed to unite them, and later on also the Romans in some way or another. Fur would become more spread, as would certain exotic fruits and vegetables, and not everyone would be really aware where Hyperborea would actually be, but everyone would know of its existence, just like China and India. Did the Romans, for instance, try to conquer those places only because they heard of them? No, of course not, because there was just no way that they could be able to achieve that. And the same thing would happen here with the Americas. Just consider the Romans trying to do that. Well, okay. How long would the communication take? I mean, even having a message from, let's say, Portugal until today's Iraq, it would take weeks, if not months. So imagine the same thing if the Romans would suddenly decide, for whatever reason, to take these Greek colonies in Hyperborea. Yeah, it would just not happen at all. The Americas, they would be left alone to some extent, but they would have their own development going on, and we could see a hybrid Hellenization happening in Northern America, while Mesoamerica would also develop in a different way, and the knowledge would spread to places as far as Peru and Chile. The Hellenization would probably stop around the Caribbean, because from there the Mayans, they would spread their culture, their way of life and their trade network. There could be clashes as well, and it's difficult to predict which entities could exist over there. Perhaps the Caribbean people, they would have their own trade empire going on, or maybe someone else could overtake the Mayans and just do their own thing. Now, with the different crops coming to Europe, this would change many things for the Roman Empire as well, and many famines they might be avoided in this timeline. Perhaps Rome may become very stable and even stay strong for a few more decades or centuries, or even longer. Perhaps the Romans at some point may be interested to assert their dominance in Hyperborea, but they would just notice that it would be too much for them. And as a result, a potential conquest of Hyperborea would be quickly forgotten, just like a potential conquest of Germania or Parthia. The societies on the east coast would be unrecognizable, but mostly Greek in the urban areas and native in the rural areas. A new Greek language could develop, and the writing of the Greeks could also spread in there. Horses too, they would spread, as well as pigs, cows, etc., giving the Native Americans more incentives of permanently settling in one place. Except for the natives who would live in drier areas. In their horses, they would turn them to fearsome horse-riding warriors. While the areas around Texas and northern Mexico, they could become a melting pot between Hellenic, Mayan, and horse warrior cultures. The Azores and Bermuda too would become important trade hubs, and some of these places may actually be held by the Romans. At least the Canary Islands or Madeira may be able to stay or become Roman. And even with a potential collapse of the Roman Empire, which maybe in this timeline is not a given due to the food supplies that they would get, the places in Hyperborea, they would stay strong and become more influential. Some Romans, they may even flee to Hyperborea during the migration period, or we could actually see the reverse happening. There could be some catastrophe going on, which would lead to many Native Americans suddenly moving away from the areas where they settled, and they would then attack the cities, the urban area on the east coast. And the people who actually settled there on the urban areas in the east coast, they would perhaps try to go back to Europe because of the connection that they would have with the Greeks. A Greek colonization would in some way be the best outcome for the world. The Greeks were not necessarily interested in taking over stuff, unlike Romans, for instance, or worse, the Spanish. And with their slow pace, the Native Americans, they could recover from sicknesses. It would give them enough time for cultures to mix, instead of one culture wiping out the other. All of the Americas would be more advanced and just be known like India or China, a faraway area with interesting goods, but not really worth it to conquer, or just not feasible to be conquered. Mayan culture would be way different. The culture beyond the Appalachian Mountains would be way different. The East Coast would be more akin to the Hellenic world, and South America in here could become a very wild card. Perhaps we see a Hellenization that would continue until there, or we would see natives trying to imitate the Greeks and making their own way of Hellenization in there, or perhaps some new culture would emerge coming from the Amazon. The world would be more connected, and even connections beyond to the Pacific Ocean could exist. And even with all the changes that could happen, the contact between the old and new world would always remain in one way or another. And we won't see big and quick changes over time. The Greeks, and maybe even the Romans and some middlemen, they could benefit from it. But the bigger winner in here, in this timeline, are actually the Native Americans, who would be on par with the rest of the world and would never see their cultures being wiped out, as in OTL. And that's where we leave it for now.
That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed my video. Be sure to like and subscribe, leave a comment, support me also on Patreon, and join my forum, forum.planetalthistory.ga. Until next time on Planet Alt History.